Crisis communication, among the most challenging disciplines of corporate communications. Is it a topic that you need more experience in or more of an understanding? Do you have a plan, but not necessarily a process to properly approach a crisis? Then welcome to part 2 of our discussion with Bob Reid, the Director of Brand Management at Veritas Communications. This episode is a continuation of our discussion of crisis communications and what communicators need to be thinking about when they find themselves in a comms crisis. Speaking of Media, the podcast where communicators and the media come together to consider the world of mass storytelling. I'm Keith Marnock, former journalist turned corporate communicator, and I'm hoping that you, as a communicator or someone who speaks on behalf of your organization, will join me for each episode to learn from industry experts on both sides of the media microphone. It's time for the second half of our chat with Bob, where he delves into how social media has interrupted the crisis response practice, how to be a polished spokesperson, or as communicators, how we can best prepare speakers or public figures to respond to media, as well as trying to have those people demonstrate authenticity and openness in their responses. In addition to being a press secretary and media counselor to former Ontario Premier Mike Harris, Bob currently contributes to the media discussion on Toronto's Newstalk 1010 CFRB radio through his Touchdowns and Fumbles feature, a weekly critique of the most obvious communications wins and debacles drawn from the past week's headlines. It's also a listener favorite segment on one of Canada's most listened to talk radio stations. But right now, you get Bob all to yourself as he breaks down the realities of the crisis communications process through the eyes of a hired gun from the world of PR. We pick up our conversation with Bob talking about how an organization needs to acknowledge crisis once it has occurred, and the dangers of downplaying rather than tackling a crisis. I want to talk about groupthink and making yourself feel like within the bounds of our walls, we're feeling pretty good about this, and the rest of the world's getting this wrong. I think we're all good with this, and looking around the room and looking for nodding heads, and that can be disastrous in a similar way to throwing gas on the fire as well. But just some thoughts about groupthink.
That's why earlier in this conversation I cited perspective as one of the essential qualities.
Love that. Detail.
Because if that mindset takes root, and well, this isn't that big a deal, and we've done an amazing job in responding to this, and you know we've got such a strong track record on this. I don't know why people are even questioning anything. Yeah, that can be highly, highly dangerous. That's also a time when outside counsel is helpful as well. It can be exceptionally valuable to gut check with people outside of your regular walls because they're not immersed in that environment every day. They're not Kool-Aid drinkers, if you will, when it comes to the corporate line and the internal mindset and all of that kind of stuff that can be very important to an organization's culture and way of thinking and all that. I'm not running it down, but if you're so immersed inside that bubble that you're not accurately seeing how the issue at hand is playing out outside the bubble, then that's a real problem. And that's where outside counsel can be so helpful.
It really wouldn't be a crisis if people weren't thinking badly of you, right? And you have to understand what their perception of you is. It's got to be a part of the mix, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Social media, we kind of touched on this a little bit. And it's like, I'm going to talk like it's just started like a couple of weeks ago, but how has social media really changed the practice of issues management? I often think around, having come from the positions that I've worked in, how it affects news cycle, how it affects perceptions turning into realities, how it can influence or force communicators to overreact. Again, I love the whole idea around perspective and context on things. What's the biggest problem that social media usually brings when a file comes your way?
I love to say that the great thing about social media is it's given anybody with an internet connection the ability to publish or broadcast. The worst thing about social media is it's given anybody with an internet connection, yada yada yada. It's very double-edged that way, and it's also double-edged in terms of the advantages that it offers and some of the perils that it brings as well. On the advantage side, it's amazing how in relatively short history, journalistically, we've moved from social media being a brand new thing that wasn't necessarily taken at full face value to now being the equivalent of the press release. And I can think of multiple organizations that they don't do press releases to media anymore. When they have something to announce, they tweet it and they link it back to an announcement on their website, or they do it on their blog, or they do it via Instagram.
Right.
You know, now today we've seen presidential campaigns launched through social media first.
Right.
Mainstream media will report quotes from social media posts, certainly from Twitter and also Instagram and anywhere else, but without even batting an eye. That gets put straight into reporting because it's verified that it's from that source, and this individual who represents this organization made this statement. Boom, it's on the air. It's in the newspaper the next day.
Right.
Whereas, you know, before you used to see attributions like, you know, in an email so and so said.
Right.
You know, now that's just a direct quote.
Right.
The vehicle has become less and less important, and for communicators, it's an exceptionally handy tool because you can connect with your audience immediately. If you got to get something out there in a hurry, you can do it, and it will get noticed. It will get traction. The flip side of it, the negative side, I guess, is the universe of trolls or whatever you call it, because there is no shortage of haters out there for any brand, for any organization, whether it's specific that people have a hate on for or a vendetta against for some reason, or if it's just the people who like to take shots at anything that moves out there. Right. You're going to get all of those. And again, back to perspective. You know, sometimes we'll get calls from client organizations who have a social media presence, and they're like, "Oh, we've got people saying terrible things about us on social media. What do we do? What do we do? This is an emergency. This is red hot." And it's like, well, hold on. Who are they? How many of them are there? And do they have any reach? Are the posts that they're making or the tweets or whatever it is, do they have any resonance? Are they sparking any discussion or feeding into any discussion? Or is it just somebody with a handful of followers ranting and tagging your brand in it and naming your organization? They're just, you know, throwing up the window and yelling and screaming about you.
Yeah.
And so that perspective is important. And that's the first thing that we look at when we get those calls. Like, we think something might be blowing up on social media that could be really bad for us. Well, first of all, let's get a sense of, as I say, who is it? Do they have any followers? Do people pay attention to them? Are they nobodies? Are they just cranks?
Yep.
Or are they somebody whose word sparks a ton of response comments and forwards and all of that stuff? So
right.
That's one of the first assessments you got to make as well.
Yeah. I love the whole idea how it's changed the practice, and like you say, you skip the steps around attribution and so on when it comes to material that's taken from social media, because I think that organizations do go down that road, and a lot of them, like you say, have basically disposed of the news release and are now telling their own stories through their own channels, which is good because there's stakeholders and there's people who are interested in what's going on. I expand that out a little bit because I'm wondering if you're seeing, like I'm guessing and have experienced, that not all crises have a particular responsible party, not just a solo or one. Often, if it's a big enough story, there's more than a particular organization that's in the spotlight. And sometimes, the one or two organizations that are maybe in partnership, one's a bit more obvious than others, even though it causes grief or a sense of responsibility for others who are closely connected to an organization that's experiencing a crisis. Would you agree that it's never quite as simple and black and white as it may appear in the newspaper in terms of who's actually sweating over an issue?
Depends on the circumstance. Some issues are very specific to an individual organization and individual people within that individual organization. Others are more sector wide, right? It can be a negative issue situation that is rippling across an entire sector of businesses, for example.
Yep.
And so any business that's in that field could be and probably is having to deal with the negative repercussions of this. And that's a scenario where the individual companies within that sector need to make some decisions in terms of do they need to take any ownership for it? Should they? Or do they not have to? Because not every bad story, even if it affects the area that you do business in, is one that you should own or that your brand necessarily has to be connected to. And as a former journalist yourself, you remember these stories, right? There's an issue at play in this area. I've got to find somebody from a company that's part of that sector that can give me perspective that can speak to this story. So what do? You start making calls.
Right.
You call Coke, and if Coke doesn't respond, then you call Pepsi, and if they don't respond, then you just go down the list of those companies, those businesses in that category until you can find somebody who will give you what you need for your story. From the communications management standpoint, those are cases where you have the pass or play option. You don't have to be the poster child for your industry necessarily. Yeah. And if it's a negative story, you probably don't want to be the one putting your hand up saying, yeah, I'll give you an interview and talk about this terrible thing and have my company name attached to it, when it's not something that your company owns necessarily. You're just into it by broader association.
It can be a downside of having good, close relationships with sector or beat reporters, right? And so that's not necessarily always a case of you saying no comment, but you can be strategic about how you go about being positioned in a story. And in a very specific way, the most simple approaches to media. Who else are you talking to in this story? It can be asked of reporters. Trying to get a sense, again, of context, of scope of what's going on out there, right? And I would say, and I always, in these kinds of situations, I always suggest, if it's at all about you and it's a broad enough story, you need to be getting your own story together, whether or not you're putting your hand up, whether or not you're finding a way to not be the focus, because sometimes in those stories, when there could be many people who are involved, the people who speak up, it becomes about them, perhaps unfairly. The other approach there can be, and you can correct me on this, is to be in contact with your partners or the affected responsible parties and have a strategy to go out. There is opportunity in crisis. There can be ways that you are able to demonstrate what's going on, not only to correct perhaps bad perceptions, but to bring a greater focus on what your organization is doing. So this isn't about avoiding media. It's just trying to be strategic about the way that you respond and are represented in stories. So
and that example that we were talking about, that's the time when associations can be your best friend. Yep. Industry organizations who speak for the industry writ large, so that that is the role for those communicators to speak to the broader issue that is bedeviling an entire sector,
Right.
rather than the individual companies involved necessarily.
Yeah.
Assuming again that the issue is equally spread.
Yes.
If it's clearly owned by one player, then that's a different story. But if it's something that's kind of across the sector, then that is the time for an industry association, a trade association, a professional association to be the voice of its members.
It's great. Hey, we're getting great value here, Bob. This is all really great stuff.
Worth every penny you've paid for it, sir.
Well, exactly. But one area that I really want to hear from you on is that of spokesperson, and what communicators need to be thinking about, whether they are the spokesperson or there's someone who is responsible for preparing someone to be out for media or other opportunities to speak on behalf of an organization. Good and bad. What's the up and down side, and what do ultimately, who are the best spokespeople?
The best spokespeople are the ones who understand the role and understand the mission, and who understand the importance of message focus, but also have the other side of it, and that's just the talent, I guess, for lack of a better word, to be able to roll with tough or unexpected questions or angles, and to be able to respond to them in a way that returns back to the important messaging that the organization needs to get across, while at the same time truly being responsive and transparent and as forthcoming as possible under the circumstances. Sometimes you'd love to be able to say more, but you just can't for a number of reasons. Other times it's strategically not advantageous to get into great levels of detail. But the best spokespeople are the ones who can credibly represent their organization, deliver the most important messages for the circumstance at hand, and do it in a way that reinforces positively the core brand aspects of that business or of that organization. In the role of communications aid, communications staff, the people who prepare the spokesperson. When I worked for the Premier, I used to say sometimes that on a good day I was in the surprise elimination business. That the best days were days that when he walked out in front of the assembled press gallery and took questions on every issue that was on the boil at the time, regardless of what particular aspect of the government it was in. If everything that came up was something that we had talked about beforehand, that was a good day at the office for me. You always lived in fear of the left fielder that you didn't see coming, not because the Premier I worked for or any executive that I've worked with, not that they're not capable of answering questions by themselves or dealing with the unexpected in the moment, not by a long shot, but it's always better if you've had the opportunity to have some discussion ahead of time to frame messages and approaches to an issue at hand. So from a support standpoint, anticipating and helping prepare as much as possible is the single best way that you can support the spokesperson that you're working with, ensuring their comfort level so that they have a very clear sense of what it is they need to get across through that opportunity to the audiences they need to reach. What are the important messages? What are the things they need to watch out for? Are there any real landmines that, if it came up, could potentially make a bad situation worse? And if so, how best to deal with those? You can never anticipate everything, as I've said earlier, but the more you can kind of war game out and prepare a spokesperson so that if they're confronted with something that, if they weren't prepared for it, would make their blood run cold and would be, oh my God, what do I do now? How do I possibly respond to this? if you've been able to fire drill that out beforehand, if this comes up, here's the first place you've got to get to in terms of a response message. Here's the first idea that's imperative that we get out. And then secondly, we need to shift the focus a little bit into this area that is actually positive for us, where we do have some progress to report, where we do have some good things that we can point to and move forward from there. If you've done that construct ahead of time, then when that nasty issue gets raised, when that tough question comes up, the spokesperson's response internally is not, oh my God, what do I do now? It's, we talked about this. Okay, right. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. I know where I'm supposed to take this when I've got the floor.
Right. Yeah, spokespeople responses can really be the front line or the headline of so much other work that's going on behind the scenes that support what they're saying, and being able to demonstrate if they're saying that, you know, they're reacting to something by putting something in place. Having that work going on in the background, usually when these things are going on, is so very important. I know I've often heard from people saying that spokespeople need to have a thick skin. I always believe that the person with the most emotional intelligence was the one that I really wanted to have out there. Someone who could read the you know, what the real concern or what the story was that was building in a reporter's mind that they were trying to get at through their questions, and sort of understand that and give back a reassuring or a reasonable response. I always felt like, especially in really high high emotional type situations, that those kind of people in front of the camera were the ones that I liked having there. I know that you'll be a proponent of media training, but let's say somebody doesn't get that far and they're thrust into the spotlight. Is there sort of a magic time or some phrase you might put into somebody's head? What's the one thing that a spokesperson really needs to have in their mind before they walk out on stage or in front of those microphones, in your view, to really be successful?
What's your message? What is the important message or messages that you need to get across through this interaction? And connected to that is, who's the audience that you're really trying to speak to? You know, you're not talking to a TV camera. You're talking to specific people who are watching TV at the other end of it. Yeah. Who are they, and what do they need to hear you saying? So job one is know the message and have that internalized. Have a clear sense of what is the North Star here. What's the path that I need to be on, and that really sets the guardrails for a spokesperson, even if that's the only sort of brief they have going in. If they know what it is they need to get across, not what the script is or what the lines are. We don't work that way, right? It's what's the message? What's the important information that you need to articulate in a way that it's going to resonate with the audience that needs to hear that, and gives them the information or the reassurance or whatever it is that they need. And also, once you have that sense, once you know what the path is, then by extension, you also know what questions are trying to pull you off of that and try and take you in a different direction from the one that you need to be heading in. And that is the taffy pull with media, particularly in contentious situations, right? They want to knock people off their speaking points. They want to knock people off message so that they can be satisfied that the message that they're being given is in fact the truth, and is in fact the facts of the matter.
Yeah, people, reporters aren't necessarily, different people come at it from different points of view. But I love that idea that they're not tricking you to trick you. They're trying to understand whether or not you know what you're talking about, and whether or not it holds water when put up against what the perception is of this bad thing that's going on. Right. Really, really appreciate your time, Bob. Just one more quick one, maybe. And
sure.
We talk a lot about this, the ever evolving, the ever changing landscape of media and media relations. What kinds of trends are you seeing out there? Are there things that are popping up now more than they have in the past? Are there things that, people who are in this kind of line of work need to be looking out for, or they just need to be, doubling down on being prepared and expecting the unexpected?
Well, what I see is a continuation of what we've all seen for quite a number of years now, sadly, and that's the continued erosion of traditional mainstream media, the relentless downsizing of media organizations and newsrooms, and I think that's a detriment to society overall, because an effective, intelligent, informed, and journalistically responsible media is one of the foundations of our society. Not to say that we're all going to hell in a handbasket because the newspapers aren't as big as they used to be. So I'm troubled by the demise of the traditional mainstream media. There are some bright spots in terms of the alternatives and new media sites. There's tremendous specialization out there, and it's really quite insightful for me, for some of the clients that I work on, that in their sector, the most important media audiences are those specialty websites that follow their business and do a really good job in reporting on a highly specialized basis to a highly engaged audience that really cares about their business. That's actually a quite positive development in a lot of ways as well. So I'm getting used to the changes and how dramatically different it is from when you and I started our education and our careers in journalism. And I'm hopeful that it will ultimately shake out to a point where people do go back to, and I think it's happening already. I think we've hit the bottom and are coming back up in terms of people starting to be a lot more careful than they've been in more recent times in questioning sources of things that they see, online and in their social media feeds. Oh, I saw a story that said this. Did you see that? Yeah, I did. Did you check the source? Did you see where that story originated? Was there any credibility to it? More and more people are taking that very important step. We didn't used to have to do it because, in the olden days, the only media that we were able to receive from were highly credible by nature because they just didn't exist otherwise and couldn't exist otherwise.
Love that perspective. And I think we both would agree, having long since left the media microphones on our side to come the other side. It's really difficult to be successful with media relations without respecting those on the other side of the table. I feel like that's a necessary place where you've got to arrive, especially in serious issues or stories where there's a lot of context, a lot of understanding that has to go on, dealing with stories that require research, that require understanding of greater themes. I always find that you have to at least look for the credibility in those who are covering you and try to build on that, and the professionalism that can exist between those who do the connection between organizations and the media or other voices. You need to be professional in what you do, and more often than not, that brings out the professionalism in those that you're dealing with. So
absolutely do. You've just encapsulated the key value of effective media relations and good media relations. Yeah. And it starts with mutual respect and being able to work together and understanding that both sides of the equation, both parties, they have a job to do, and they're professional in the work that they do and in the way they approach their work.
Bob, thanks so much for taking the time to share your views and your commentary and your insights on media relations and crisis communication. Love to have you back on the show. There's so many other topics that I'd love to delve into with you. Not the least of which would be network television in the States and what that's meant for the president there, but how the president has spawned so many questions and so many so much rethinking of what media is and how it affects people and so on. And anyhow, any number of other topics. Would love to get you back on the program when we get the chance. But thank you so very much for taking the time to be on this particular episode. And again, we look forward to talking to you again at some point in the future.
It's been great, Keith. I've really enjoyed the conversation myself. Thank you.
And so our thanks go out to Bob Reid for another great episode where he revealed the mindset of a communicator, especially in the time of crisis, and what you can be thinking about as a communicator when identifying and planning for crisis now, rather than being surprised and caught in a negative media storm with no defined place to start dealing with your issue. You can find the online link to Bob's weekly iHeartRadio segment, Touchdowns and Fumbles, in this episode's show notes. For now, thanks for connecting. Speaking of Media is available on all podcast platforms, including Google and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. However you find the show, I hope you will listen, like, comment, and subscribe to the cast, as this will help us expand the show's reach and attract quality content. Also consider joining our Speaking of Media Communicators discussion group on Facebook, where we'll be hosting live chats with industry experts and where you can engage with the guests yourself. You'll find us on Instagram, LinkedIn under my profile, and on Twitter @MediaSpeaking. I'm Keith Marnock, and through other episodes, I look forward to our next time together when we will be speaking of media.